Hello and welcome to the Deviant's World. I'm Eric Servini, and today I am here with Timothy Stewart-Winter, a historian of sexuality, gender, and modern U.S. politics. His first book, Queer Clout, right here, is amazing. Chicago and the Rise of Gay Politics. It was awarded the 2017 John Boswell Prize, who's actually another personal hero of mine, by the Committee on LGBT History. He is now working on a book about what we're going to be talking about today, the one and only Walter Jenkins, a longtime aide to Lyndon B. Johnson, who resigned from the White House staff in 1964 about being arrested on disorderly conduct charges. Timothy co-directs the Queer Newark Oral History Project as well. Timothy, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
And so, I got to know you through this book, but when I saw, I think on Twitter, that you were working on this book about Walter Jenkins, I said, oh my gosh, we have to talk because, I am a Texan. I, of course, am a historian of the 60s, and the story of Walter Jenkins was one that I wish I had gotten to spend a lot more time on in my book. And so I'm so excited to talk about what you found about him and tell the story of what really is the biggest queer scandal in all of U.S. American history, I would say. So before
I agree.
Yeah. So before we begin, also, it is exactly, we were just talking about this, the 56th, I believe, anniversary to the day of October 7th, 1964. And so I was wondering if we could start off with you telling me what was going on at this time. What was happening 56 years ago in America?
So it was the height of the Cold War. The Beatles had taken America by storm, appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show. Lyndon B. Johnson was the president and had become president after after the assassination of John F. Kennedy 11 months earlier. And he was running for re-election in his own right. So October, was a month out of the election, from the presidential election. Johnson had had passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and signed it earlier that summer, but it didn't include voting rights, and so there was continuing struggle over voting rights in the South, and Vietnam situation was worsening, so those were kind of the things on Johnson's radar at this moment. And of course, Frank Kameny had testified before Congress the previous year.
Yes, indeed. And so, of course, it was 1964, and we're in election year now. So and it was an election year then, and so similarly, just weeks before the 1964 election. So what was the state of the race? Who was LBJ running against? What was happening on the political front?
So Johnson was running against Barry Goldwater, who was considered almost far right, very, very conservative Republican who was behind. Johnson was way ahead, widely expected to win the presidency easily because Goldwater was seen as such a conservative to the point of being scary to people candidate. And Johnson had made his control of the country's nuclear codes a campaign issue, and sort of said, Goldwater, might start a war, can't be trusted with national security, which is part of why it was so kind of alarming for Johnson when it turned out he had a security risk on his own staff.
Right. And of course, I think a lot of people who have studied American history have seen the Daisy ad from 1964, which I've always said, if Hillary Clinton had played that ad 4 years ago, she absolutely would have won. Because if you haven't seen it, go Google on YouTube LBJ 1964 Daisy ad. It will scare you senseless. And it is one that I think, as we're experiencing our own problems in America and national security threats, it is one that has proven a bit too close to home. And so you mentioned, I write in my book, Time magazine had said nothing it had seen could conceivably stand in the way of Democrat Lyndon Johnson's inexorable march back to the White House. But then, exactly 56 years ago, so this is October 7th, Wednesday, it was even a same day of the week.
Yes, it was.
What was happening that night in Washington, D.C.?
So LBJ was campaigning in Illinois, and Lady Bird Johnson, the First Lady, was on a whistle-stop tour of the South by herself, which was sort of a first. And Walter Jenkins had a kind of ordinary day at work at the White House. He'd actually met with Hubert Humphrey, who was Johnson's running mate. And then in the evening, he went with members of Johnson's cabinet and many other kind of Washington luminaries to a cocktail party at in the new offices of Newsweek magazine, very close to the White House, up Pennsylvania Avenue. New building, floor-to-ceiling glass windows with a view of the National Mall, and so Jenkins went to this cocktail party for about an hour. Then he left.
And before we keep going, sorry to interrupt. Who exactly, for people who don't know Walter Jenkins, I'm obsessed with him. You're writing a book on him, and some people, even people who have lived through the election, may have remembered what happened. But for people who don't know that name, who was he? What was he doing at this party, and what was his job and his life up to this moment?
Totally. Right. So Walter Jenkins was the longest serving staffer for Lyndon B. Johnson. He had worked for LBJ for 25 years. He was Johnson first hired Jenkins in 1939 when Johnson was a member of Congress, House of Representatives, and Jenkins had been by his side as Johnson rose to become Senate Majority Leader in the late 50s and then Vice President in the 60s. And so when Kennedy was assassinated, suddenly Jenkins was the right-hand man to the president. And actually, Jenkins was in Washington on November 22nd, 1963. But while Johnson was waiting for President Kennedy's body to be loaded onto the airplane at Love Field in Dallas, he called Walter Jenkins and asked him, do you think that there's an ongoing threat to the country? What's going to happen next? Like, so he was the White House staffer who could speak for Johnson, who Johnson trusted the most, and who knew all of Johnson's secrets. So he was, very, very close to the president. He was sort of like he was like his Michael Cohen as well as his Mark Meadows, I guess.
Right, Jesus. And you mentioned the secrets that he knew, and LBJ, as we know now, had quite a few of them to be keeping track of. But on top of those personal and financial secrets, also secrets of national security, right? This was someone with the highest possible access to classified information. And, one thing that I talk about and that Frank Kameny was fighting was this notion that if you were gay, then you were necessarily a national security risk because foreign agents could presumably blackmail you. So that's important thing to keep in mind. But let's get back to this night. So host this party hosted by Kay Graham, if anyone's seen the Post. That's Meryl Streep's character, the publisher of the Post. She was hosting this party at the new offices of Newsweek. And so Walter Jenkins shows up, and you said he stayed there an hour, and then what happened?
So then he took the elevator downstairs. His wife went off to a dinner party somewhere else. He said he forgot something upstairs, went back upstairs, I think maybe to get his umbrella, and then went around the corner to the G Street YMCA, which was after Lafayette Park, probably the most popular place for men to cruise for sex in downtown Washington. Went into the Y, across the lobby, down the stairs, where if you went one way, there was a bowling alley, and the other way, there was the men's room of the YMCA. Mm-hmm. And there, he had oral sex with a stranger, a guy who was Hungarian-born Army veteran, kind of a drifter, and while they had oral sex in a toilet stall, two plainclothes policemen spied on them through a transom over the door.
Mm-hmm. And so some people might have an inkling of what the YMCA meant and has meant in queer culture, especially as a site for these kinds of liaisons. Of course, everyone knows that the song by the Village People, which is, of course, referencing this exact phenomenon. And so I'm wondering, to take a step back a bit, what were those police officers doing there? Why were they spying on this restroom in the first place?
It's a great question. This was totally routine police surveillance of public sex between men. And this had become, this was a key part of gay male life in mid-20th century America. And one of the risks, if you went to a gay bar, the bar might be raided. If you went to a park or a public bathroom to cruise, as some men did, whether they identified as gay or thought of themselves as gay or not, you might be arrested. So in this restroom, 44 men had been arrested just in the 6 months prior to Jenkins. Wow. So the police were there on a kind of routine basis. Ostensibly, it was the morals division of the Metropolitan Police Department that did this. Does that answer your question? Yes.
And I think I'm glad you mentioned how perilous those gay bars are, because I think some people would say now, why would you go into a restroom? And what you have to remember is that in mid-century America, so many people who were in the closet, who may have had roommates or may have been living with family or had a landlord who was watching, there was no Grindr, there was no Tinder. If you wanted a sexual encounter and you couldn't afford to go to a gay bar and risk being exposed, because like you said, they could be raided at any moment, totally. The only place you could go was a place like Lafayette Park or the YMCA, and various other cruising grounds. So he
It was kind of the grinder of its
exactly.
day.
I know Lord Humphreys' book, Tea Room Trade. I think one of the most remarkable quotes in that book is he says what the deviant needs is a pocket-sized device to find sex, and you read that, and he writes this in the late '60s, early '70s, and you're like, wait a second, we literally invented that, and he called for it 50 years ago. So Walter Jenkins, one thing we should mention is also he was married. He had several kids, right? He was Catholic and had
Six children.
Six. There it is. So six children. Happily married. It seemed, and so he gets arrested. And what happens at the police station?
So he's questioned along with the other man he's arrested with. Two cops had observed him, right, so they could kind of back each other up, had observed this encounter. He was fingerprinted, which turned up the fact that he had been arrested once before in the same restroom. More on that in a sec. And then he paid $50 as collateral and was released. Mm-hmm. So essentially, it's somewhat like as if he kind of pled guilty and agreed not to contest the charge.
Right.
And then he went back to the White House actually and worked some more before going back home.
I think that's one of the most remarkable parts. Like it's 3 weeks before an election. He knew what had just happened, and if the press had found out that he had the very real possibility of ruining the career of President Johnson, and so he goes back to the White House to continue working. And so then what happened? How did the press find out, and what happened then?
So, some of this I'll get into in my book. Basically, the story broke 1 week later when someone on the night of October 13th, so 6 days after the arrest, there were a lot of rumors on Capitol Hill that day, and someone called a reporter for the Washington Star with a tip. And early the next morning, the Star sent people to look at the police ledger in the Morals Division of police headquarters to confirm it's a public document. You couldn't look it up online. You had to actually go look in person. And they saw that this seemed to be the same Walter Jenkins who worked for the White House. So an editor for the Star, this newspaper, called Jenkins in the White House and said, do you know anything about this? And Jenkins said, let me call you back, right? And at that point, he panicked, and Johnson was campaigning in New York City. Two of Johnson's kind of most trusted outside advisors, who were also lawyers, spent the day trying to persuade the Washington papers not to publish this story on kind of humanitarian grounds. Were they pressuring them? Probably, yes. Were there also kind of legitimate, is this news or not questions? Maybe. And then at 6 p.m., the head of the Republican National Committee went before reporters and said, the White House is covering up a grave threat to national security. And then at 8:09 p.m., one of the wire services broke the story that, in fact, Walter Jenkins, the closest man to the president, who knew all these secrets had been arrested on a morals charge, which was the sort of newspaper word for this type of arrest.
Mm-hmm.
Later that night.
Oh, go ahead.
Well, it was soon also reported that he had been previously arrested in the same restroom, which and you sort of talked about this with Kameny, that Kameny had actually been arrested twice, which made it impossible to sort of claim this was some sort of fluke, right? Mm-hmm. And so Jenkins was hospitalized for nervous exhaustion and resigned.
Mm. And you mentioned this, one of the reasons why the two lawyers, one of whom was Abe Fortas, who would become a Supreme Court justice, was trying to pressure these newspapers to refrain from publishing the information due to humanitarian reasons. So I'm curious, what were those humanitarian reasons, and how did he end up in the hospital?
Right. So the humanitarian reasons were basically that he had a wife and 6 kids. And for this story to be published would ruin his life. Mm-hmm. It would destroy the career of someone who had loyally served the government for 25 years. And it would cause a lot of suffering. They were partly trying to stall for time so that they knew there was no way that Jenkins could come back to the White House, really. But the fact that he had a wife and kids, that was and they would be harmed. That made it sort of, that was the humanitarian grounds. And he was taken to a hospital. I mean, the real reason was to get him away from reporters, right? to put him somewhere where nobody would photograph him or try to interview him. They sort of put together this story that he had high blood pressure and was exhausted, and that was why he was being hospitalized.
Right. And I believe he said he had blacked out and had no memory of it or something. Am I remembering that correctly?
That's right. That's
Yes.
exactly right. He had no memory of what happened in the men's room, either that time or the previous time 5 years earlier.
Right. Of course. And so, again, this is a few weeks before the election. It becomes international news that there is a quote-unquote security risk at the highest level of the White House. And so how did LBJ and the administration and also the press react to this huge bombshell?
Well, it was on the front page of every newspaper in the country. Johnson emphasized, the White House emphasized, that he had a wife and children, and that he was a Catholic, and Johnson really struggled with what to do about this story, because the fact that there was a previous arrest, either Johnson knew about that arrest and had concealed it, which would be bad, or he didn't know about it, which meant somehow this information that he should have gotten didn't get to him, right? So Johnson emphasized that he didn't know anything about this. The press, asked the question, why didn't the president know about the previous arrest? What went wrong here? And was there a threat to national security? Did he, the running mate of Barry Goldwater said Any agent of a communist government could have found this out and maybe did. So this is a very serious campaign story, and the biggest threat to Johnson's campaign, which up until now has been going swimmingly.
Right. Right. So what ended up happening during that election? Did it ruin the campaign for Johnson?
It didn't. It didn't. Johnson was too far ahead. Also, he kind of lucked out because several other big news stories broke the next day, and kind of pushed the Jenkins scandal off the front page. In particular, the Soviet Union, the premier was ousted in kind of a Kremlin coup, you could say. Nikita Khrushchev, who had been at the center of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and so there was this other Cold War intrigue that surfaced. Lady Bird Johnson released a statement, which was very unusual, saying, my heart breaks for this man who has served the government for so long, and for his wife and children, and basically, he's working this out with his priest and his doctor. So sort of spinning it as a medical issue,
right.
rather than police or a national security issue.
And it was kind of a double-edged sword, right? This medicalization of homosexuality at the time, because they were able to spin it as a not a scandal, but something we should be sympathetic towards. Even, Goldwater didn't campaign on it out of concern of the family, as you mentioned. And, LBJ called for his recovery. And, it showed, as you said, that kind of weird double bind that LBJ and also his FBI and J. Edgar Hoover was in that, they had to choose between admitting that they knew about it and letting him stay, or in the case of J. Edgar Hoover, admitting that he wasn't really a national security risk, or admitting that he was. And so he opted for the former, thereby implying that actually it was possible to be a homosexual in the federal government without being a national security risk, because he was such a good man, right? Which I think is so fascinating. So I'm curious what happened as a result of this scandal, because of course there were activists like Frank Kameny, like the Mattachine societies across the country. Were they aware of what happened?
Oh yeah, I mean it was front page news. It was on the radio, and Kameny wrote letters that you quote from these letters to newspapers saying, now that everybody knows Walter Jenkins is a homosexual, the government should hire him again because he can't be blackmailed now, right? And this is the argument that Kameny has started to make, as you described, that if someone has come out, if someone has disclosed, or in Jenkins' case, had it disclosed about them, that they have this tendency, then the security risk is no longer there, right? So at the same time, this isn't for Kameny. This isn't a test case, right? Jenkins isn't the plaintiff you want, isn't in a situation where he can challenge the ban on gay federal employees because he was arrested in these scandalous circumstances,
right?
And so publicly, right?
And also, it was, not indicative of his identity. It was merely an indiscretion of a blackout of sorts.
Right. Totally.
Right.
Yeah, and Jenkins was unlike Kameny, didn't live a gay life, and and certainly wasn't going to challenge the ban on gay employees.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it's so interesting seeing some of the correspondence within activists like Frank Kameny who were saying, actually, it's probably not a good idea for us to get involved, because if we want him to get his job back, then it's probably not a good idea to have, homosexual activists advocating on his behalf. So they kind of left it to ACLU and these other civil libertarians to kind of do that arguing for them, which is fascinating. And so my last question is what ended up happening to Jenkins? Because I actually, I focus mostly on the media's reaction to it, because they just covered it with such fervor, and it created the snowball effect of additional stories about queer spaces like the YMCA, like Lafayette Park, and also people began asking, why are there police officers invading my privacy? Because if they're looking out for homosexuals in public restrooms, what about me when I'm using a public restroom? Does that mean someone's watching me? And so it started this new dialogue about privacy. But I'm curious what ended up happening to Walter.
So the FBI did a huge investigation. And wrote a report that said he didn't damage national security, and that news, the White House kind of pushed out that news. He stayed in the hospital until just after the election day, conveniently, 26 days in the hospital.
Wow.
And
if only our president would stay in the hospital that long.
Right, and be kept away from reporters.
Yes.
And his phone.
Yes.
So Jenkins, it's a real problem. What's going to happen to him? He is never seen publicly with Lyndon Johnson again. He does stay in touch with other people in the White House. He, has all this expertise. But he disappears as a public figure. He goes into he moves with his family back to Texas, to Austin, and becomes a management consultant. Which kind of meant that he could work for different clients without any one company having him on their payroll, basically. And he lived 21 more years, remained married to his wife, Marjorie Jenkins, never came out of the closet, never had a gay identity, actually. That's very hard for us to understand now, right? But in fact, there were lots of men who were like Jenkins, and actually more who were like Jenkins than like Frank Kameny, right? Right. Kameny being so unusual in embracing the idea of being public about being gay. Right. So, he lived a quiet life. Johnson did some things to help him, but behind the scenes, and he was seen as kind of radioactive, even though his daughter and Johnson's daughter were best friends, and stayed best friends. So it's an illustration, actually, of the degree of the way that the purges of gay federal employees don't just hurt gay people, right? They also hurt the president of the United States, who loses this talented person in a very kind of spectacular and painful way.
Right. And who knows what would have happened in LBJ's second term if he had stayed on. How the course of the war would have changed. We're getting into hypotheticals, but I think that's such a good point that any sort of persecution spirals outward to hurt not just the oppressed but everyone. But at least I actually didn't know that about him becoming a management consultant. And so there's a little bit of, you compare it to people like Frank Kameny, who lived in destitution for the rest of his life. It's good he at least was able to retain his family and some employment. But Timothy Stewart-Winter, thank you so much for sharing this story with us. Hopefully we don't get too many more October surprises 56 years later. We've already had enough, I think. But everyone, and before I let you go, do we have a title yet for your book and when we can expect it? Not yet.
Not yet. And no pub date either, but next couple years.
Stay tuned. Well, until then, Queer Clout, everyone, is wonderful. It was one of the first books that I was directed towards as I was becoming a queer historian. It is such a great survey of gay politics in Chicago. Wonderful. And thank you so much for joining us. And we'll pour one out tonight for Walter Jenkins.
Indeed. Thanks so much.